So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to apologize for this little technical problem that we have, and these things happen sometimes. And now it's solved, and we can all attend the seminar. This is the fourth seminar for Lead Future this year. We are gonna record in this, and it's going to be set in the repository of our webpage, so you can even watch it later. And in today's webinar, we're going to talk about a book, a very interesting book that it was published around a year ago, something like that, maybe less than a year. And in order to introduce it, I will just gonna read some lines, and after that, I'm going to open the floor for the real important people in this webinar, who is the editors and the writers of the different chapters. So what is that of that book? Contesting, sorry, the Climate Unthinkable serves as a rigorous academic intervention, sorry, into the intersecting fields of environmental, humanities, political ecology, and climate justice. By engaging with the cognitive and systematic limitation of contemporary discourse, this work interrogates why the scale of ecological collapse remains largely unthinkable within traditional sociopolitical and literary frameworks. The book moves beyond mere critique, contesting established narratives that decouple climate change from historical power structures and colonial legacies. Through a series of interdisciplinary analysis, it elevates marginalized perspectives and reimagines radical futures that transcend current cognitive impasses. Ultimately, this volume provides a relevant map, for scholars and practitioners dedicated to dismantling the systematic barriers that prevent meaningful actions in the Anthropocene. So now, as I said before, it's time for the editors to speak. We're going to start by Ken Benson, emeritus professor in the Department of Romance Studies and Classics at the University of Estocolmo. And so, Ken, the floor is yours. I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint. Let me just uh, go here. Sorry.
Well, I can begin.
Yeah, please. I'm
And
trying to
thank you, Juan Carlos, for this
welcome.
presentation and for the opportunity to introduce this book in the context of the Erasmus Plus Lit project. And many thanks as well to the team behind the University of Florida Press, which with an invaluable professionalism at the various stages of this long trip has contributed to the quality of this volume. Because it has been a very long journey until the publication of this book at the end of the last year. For that, I must offer our apologies to the contributors from us editors, as well as I take the opportunity to express that we cannot be more grateful for your patience and for your commitment with the project. Did you find the PowerPoint?
It doesn't allow me to share, sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, um, the whole story began with a workshop that was held at Stockholm University in June 2021. Yes, you remember it was after the beginning of the horrible pandemic COVID-19 that struck the world. You know, all the planning, the fundings, the locals, the travels should be changed to hold the event digitally, like now. But in that moment, oh, I'm sorry. In that moment, it was something new which we lacked experience in. However, the workshop worked very well and the discussions were as fruitful as we were meeting in situ in the marvelous campus of Frescati, a natural paradise outside the great city of Stockholm, where Stockholm University is located. That's why we felt necessary necessary to continue the work of international collaboration until we reach the goal, the publication of this book. In the context of the pandemic, the participants get even more aware than ever of the vulnerability of humanity in a globalized and capitalistic world to rethink the position of Latin America, as Gabriel Giorgi puts it in the foreword of the book. And we can't thank you enough, Gabriel, for this precise, intelligent, and insightful preface. Latin America, and I quote Giorgi, the very laboratory of colonial and extractive practices that subtends and makes possible modern capitalism, a region shaped by multiple grammas of coloniality and extractivism. However, when we met in 2021 in this workshop, we could not imagine, it was unthinkable to use one of the key words of the volume, how the word would evolve to get even closer to the abyss of the inscrutable and irreparable, the madness of self-destruction of nature, non-humanity and humanity through the patriarchal world wars, the worst since World War II, simultaneously with an irrational, irreverent, and unsustainable political discourse, such as the pathetic appearance of the president of a community of Madrid, Isabel Díaz Ayuso, in Mexico these days, proclaiming the heroism of Hernán Cortés in front of a stunned and astonished worldwide audience. It is in this context of astonishment and of crisis of futurity, as the uncertainty about the yet to come is increasing day to day, that the academy must stand more stable than ever. The perilous situation of academic independence that we have experienced and suffered in the US has prompted a reaction by the presidents of Swedish universities to increase the academic independence from political decisions, which is crucial in the context of the intimidating culture promoted by anti-scientific political forces. Humanities, arts, and social sciences, together with the natural sciences, are all important in this historical stage where the truth of capitalism prevails to the detriment of the truth of knowledge. That's why this book is a significant contribution to raising awareness on the tremendous danger that current power poses to our nature and to our societies, showing how thinking, writing, and creating from the global south matters, as we put it in our introduction. The younger generation of researchers face indeed an Herculean task to change the poisoned circle of inconsistencies of our days. And I am very proud of having contributed to the development of independent and stringent young researchers, as my co-editors Azucena Castro and Gianfranco Selgas, who has developed during this travel an imposing academic maturity. The editorial merits of this book are exclusively theirs. It has been an authentic pleasure for me to go along with you both in your academic journey, and now I let the word to you. Please, Azucena.
Okay, thank you, Ken, and thank you so much for this invitation to talk about the volume. And since we don't, the PowerPoint, gonna show it. I show you the cover of the volume here. It is a pleasure to be with all of you. And I will comment a little bit on the main discussions in which the volume is situated, especially its main question about the thinkability or unthinkability of climate change. And one of the theoretical interlocutors of our volume, as the title suggests, is Amitav Ghosh's highly influential book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, which was published 2016. And in this book, Ghosh argues that the genre of the modern novel, the Western realist novel, obstructed environmental, planetary, and more than human entities and voices, and therefore it was unable to illuminate the ecological crisis. And therefore, the novel becomes then like a crucial factor in the making of the climate unthinkable, or the unthinkability of climate events, if we take it from a literary archive. So Ghosh argues that the format of the novel was not capacious enough for, and I quote from Ghosh's work, the uncanniness and improbability, the magnitude and interconnectedness of the transformations that are now underway. End of the quote. So these characterizations, uncanniness and improbability, describe what this great derangement means or implies. So working with Latin American cultural archives, we found resonances of Ghosh's argument that critique the dismissal of narratives and non-hegemonic genres that do not conform to these Western realist standards in the novel. While at the same time, Latin American cultural products, including novels, had been portraying the climate crisis since at least the beginning of the 20th century, and maybe also the end of the 19th century, through portrayals of deforestation, migration tales, and extractivism. So that was one of our interlocutors for the volume. And another discussion that also fed this volume is the place that the climate unthinkable had in scientific research and environmental humanities scholarship. The unthinkable has become a key word in global environmental scholarship in the 21st century, connecting diverse interdisciplinary fields. And here, as an example, you can see research projects or groups that work together, where an engineer works together with a philosopher and an artist to try to make these climate events or climate change events thinkable or graspable, or to measure these climate change events. So the unthinkable is a recurring feature in the theories of the Anthropocene. It is a key idea in, for example, in scientific projections of future climate disasters, in measurements of planetary boundaries, and in sustainability predictions to maintain the planet's balance. Also, this, to make thinkable climate events, new ways of thinking in multi-scalar terms have emerged. So the question of the scale also brings us to connects with this idea of the unthinkability of climate change. So new ways or new modes of inquiry have developed, such as thinking with microbes, or thinking with hurricanes as hyperobjects in Morton's description. So between those discussions, and together with many works in Latin American eco-criticism and environmental humanities, we observed, as I said before, that Latin American cultural production had been grappling with these questions long before the term Anthropocene was coined, and later dropped. These works were delineating different and alternative modes of thought and experiences grounded in the colonial history of extractivism. So the main questions underlying the volume are: how does Latin American cultures make climate change events thinkable and graspable? And how have these products also shaped particular understandings of regional environments? In that sense, the volume engages with the question of environmental representation in the region's cultural productions. And it engages with these questions of representation and thinkability of climate events, I think we thought from two approaches. First, kind of a diachronic approach that examines and makes visible how Latin American cultures, including also some novels, have been thinking the climate crisis since the advance of modernity and development at the beginning of the 20th century. And then a more synchronic approach that asks what scales of climate thinkability are portrayed in these cultural products, what epistemologies of thought and what temporalities of climate thought are expressed in Latin American cultural materials. We place these approaches in contemporary discussions of planetary thinking, and I will make a very brief comment about this, and maybe we can come back to this question if you want. So a key reference in this idea of planetary thinking is Mary Louise Pratt with her book Planetary Longings, where she conceptualizes a shift in perception of the geos. I mean, perceiving the planet as a unit, towards more contemporary perceptions of the planet as fragmented or as a fragmentary entity. And that fragmented perception becomes the mode of thinking about climate events and in our times, which are marked, as Ken said, by a crisis of futurity. as it becomes very challenging also to connect the local with the planetary. But also against this crisis of futurity and this fragmentation, Latin American perspectives have proposed the idea of sentipensar con la tierra, or think, feel the earth, allowing for pluriversal views from indigenous cosmologies, ecofeminism, and ancestral epistemologies that foreground how the body is affected by the territory, developing forms of terra thinking and naming the ecological crimes as terricide. So by making space for alternative forms of climate thinkability, the contributions gathered in the volume highlight very particular forms of environmental thinking. And we'll hear now later on about Victoria's, Roberto's, and José's works in the volume as examples of these alternative, radical, and situated forms of thinking that apply to the local, but it can also be thought from a more planetary perspective as well. And finally, to lead to Gianfranco, who will talk about the volume's organization, maybe the last thing I want to say is that the chapters show Latin American's cultural production's potential to enact forms of dissensus and to configure other regimes of thinkability by disrupting and challenging existing regimes of perception and representation, opening up, and this is what we hope, new possibilities for political ecological action, collective emancipation, and climate justice. And to you now, Jan.
Thank you, Asu. Thank you, the Lead Future team and everyone for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have the possibility to talk about the book with my co-editors and of course the authors that participated in the volume, so highly appreciate it. As I said, I will just give you kind of a flavor of what's the book about in the sense of the different contributions that we have had the pleasure to gather here. As you can see, we have now on screen the list of contents, and you can see the different parts the book has. It has five sections, each one of them in a way addressed from different perspectives, disciplines, with different materials, geographies, histories, what Azucena was talking about, which was how is Latin American culture a site of contestation about this idea of the unthinkable and the unthinkability of the warming condition, and how these specific scholars address this by trying to unearth, and this is something we can unpack later in the discussion if you want to, the different regimes of thinkability that these different cultural productions, artistic expressions portray or give us, right, in connection to today's socio-ecological crisis. So just to jump into the specifics, as you have it, part one was our entry point to the general discussion about what is unthinkable. For us, it was important to consider the question about unthinkability from a peripheral vision of society and the environment that has not been taken into consideration before, and that it brings together different national, local, and indigenous perspectives, epistemologies, discourses that in their own way give us alternative and in some sense radical solutions to contest climate change, while at the same time encouraging us to question the existing power structures and also to explore new sustainable forms of coexistence, right? So reimagining the land, and I'm reading here part one, Amerindian poetics and alternative ecologies for the range world. And I quote direct from our introduction, show how modern and contemporary Latin American authors, filmmakers, artists, and activists have increasingly turned their attention to environmental challenges. Their cultural expressions have also become a relevant platform to convey political, ecological, and environmental justice and injustice concerns related to how race, class, gender, and other social identities intersect with environmental issues. And then you have the contributions by Montserrat Madariaga Cano, Paul Merchant, and Andrés Ernesto Obando. Now moving on to part two, on the other hand, this one deals with what we decided to call the political ecology of artistic forms, which shows how cultural production that deals and that have dealt, because we have different, again, histories and moments in history that are covered in this chapter, that have dealt direct and indirectly with extractivism and environmental imagination, function as a form of political ecology in the sense that they question in an experimental, imaginative, and radical way of thinking the different patterns of colonization, appropriation, and exploitation of what different colleagues, among them Jason Moore, which was part of the webinars the Lead Future has organized, they call it the web of life, right? The totality of our organic and inorganic world in a way. So in other words, that specific section deals on how cultural expression served as an indispensable framework for comprehending what has been framed as the unthinkable and the different interactions that take place between humans and their environments within the context of power dynamics and socio-political structures. So moving on to part three, the unthinkable is also something that we wanted to consider within the biggest sort of historical transformation of empires, and the idea of the unthinkable in imperial history is something that has often been underpinned on how the West kept hidden and out of sight, right, within the dynamics of conquering, of othering, of extraction, of appropriation, right, of different regions. So understanding and exposing these dynamics means a revolution in the perspective we have, in the sense that it can allow us to apprehend how the history and the geography of the region, and specifically Latin America, which is what we discuss in the book, was conditioned by such violence, right? That hidden violence that was part of that. So part three, disrupting the sensible order in landscapes of contamination, toxicity, and wildfires, sort of the subproducts of extraction in a way, proposes that global South cinema, photography, and literature have the potential, right, to grapple with the unthinkability of contaminated, intoxicated, and burnt environments by attending to the relations between local and planetary scales that visuality or visual culture can give us. So just wrapping up the part four, in that section, the idea was also to think about the unthinkable as the absence of possibility to think with and to think of the other ecologies and epistemologies, specifically from the colonizer's viewpoint that they legitimize other bodies of knowledge and other ontologies. And in order to contest that, to go against that, we need to use a sort of relational thinking, right, as an ethical dimension to grasp the region's extractive histories and their geographies. So the chapters gather in Contesting Environmental Catastrophism, Queer Bodies, Afro-Indigenous Epistemologies, and the Crisis of Futurity, which Ken and Azucena were talking about, speaks to this by foregrounding relationalities inspired by queer bodies and Afro-Indigenous cosmologies expressed in science fiction and in experimental philosophy. So mobilizing alternative epistemologies, I'm quoting our introduction, beyond dominant narratives that end up in environmental catastrophism, multimedia cultural products that are analyzed in these chapters bring to the fore the racial, gender, and socioeconomic dimension and inequalities that are rooted in the crisis of futurity in the region. So to conclude these brief overview of the sections, I will briefly mention the last section of the book before I give the floor to our authors. But this one is a bit of a special tiny section we wanted to put together. As you can see, it is composed by two contributions, one by Jasmine Belmar, Choyque Purrún, the Mapuche People's Sacred Dance, and the other one by Venezuelan poet Igor Barreto, The Path Not Seen, which for us, the editors function as ethnographic and poetic interventions that in the end are very much intertwined with the overall purpose of the book, which is not only to bring to the fore these critical perspectives about contesting the climate unthinkable, but also to bring to the fore creative thinking and creative production as another way to engage with our current time. So that, in a nutshell, is the structure of the book. But now I will just pass on to Victoria Saramago, who's one of our contributors, to talk a little bit about her contribution to the book. Victoria, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gianfranco. First of all, can somebody make me co-host so I can share a couple of slides, please? Okay, meanwhile, yeah, I just wanted to say that first, I want to thank so much Azucena, Gianfranco, and Ken for this project that has been so generative from the first conference at Stockholm University to this book that is really fantastic. It is one of those books that allow us to see the field in motion, right? To see, to map out where it's coming from, where it's going to, what are some main debates, some main themes, some main sources of anxiety that are expressed in the ways, in the reading methodologies and the theoretical frameworks that are most productive to us today. So it's really exciting. I could talk a lot more about the book, but I know that you invited me to talk about my own contribution, so I'll move on to that. Let me just okay, can you see here? I guess I should. Do you see it as like a slide or as a slideshow? Okay, good. Yeah. No, but actually that's not going to work because otherwise I'm not going to be able to see my own. Sorry. Okay, it'll have to be like that so I can see my own presentation. Okay, so what I want to do here is to think a little, and that's something that is not just in this chapter, but in my work more generally, is this goal of giving some more historical density to the imaginaries that sustain and contest the current climate crisis, right? In other words, we have today's unthinkable, right? As the book eloquently proposes and develops in the introduction. How can we make sense of today's unthinkability with what has already been thought and imagined and narrated, right? In other words, how can the environmental imaginaries that populate the ways through which we understand Latin American culture and environment help us make sense and think about what presents itself to us today as unthinkable? And to this end, I focus on this classical figure of environmental conservation and of environmental imagination that is the national park, right? It's like a late 19th century invention that also has had many predecessors for sure. And I want to focus on this connection between national parks and fiction writing, right? Because what are national parks? You basically reserve a large tract of land, right? And most national parks do not have human people living there, like populations, but sometimes they do, right? And the relationship between humans and non-humans is kind of quite contested in the space of national parks. The classical figure of the national park would be the idea of an untouched nature, pristine nature, all this kind of pre-Lapsarian terms, these terms from an Edenic imagination, right? That are, of course, very, on the one hand, keep their allure today, but also present a number of challenges, especially when we think about this relationship or the place for populations that oftentimes were already living there for many centuries before the creation of national parks. So the national parks create this appearance of an untouched nature, but at the same time, there is a lot of environmental engineering and control that is necessary to keep this appearance of untouched nature, right? And what I want to ask here is, what is the role of fiction in this process, right? And the hypothesis that I put forward in the chapter is that fiction, I mean, novels, not necessarily about national parks, but about places that would become national parks, So fiction writing can reinforce the need and appearance of a pristine nature, right? And in this sense, they help develop a set of fictionalizing operations that legitimize the environmental management tool that is represented by the national park. In other words, novels can help us imagine this pristine nature, right? But also like a pristine nature that does not come with the sort of environmental and engineering and population control of human population who lives in the park, right? So they kind of stay in the threshold of how to help us imagine this pristine nature at the same time as they challenge this very perspective. And in order to do that, I bring two examples. The first one is set in Brazil, in the state of Minas Gerais. And it is through the novel Grande Sertão Veredas that has been translated as The Devil to Pay in the Backlands. There is a new, very exciting translation coming up next year of this novel. And this is a novel that is very canonical, that really has come to represent the idea of backlands in central areas in Brazil. And this novel, which was published in 1956, came to kind of become a sort of environmental agent in the region of Minas Gerais. That is what I propose in the chapter. Right? So a series of initiatives have been fostered and created in order to try to keep or to recuperate or to draw attention to what to the landscapes that are represented in the novel. And the most important one of them, for sure, is the Grande Sertão Veredas National Park, right? So the very name of the park already refers to the novel. It's a park created in 1989, but that really gained more momentum in terms of management in the early 2000s. And it is fascinating to see how, if you look at management documents or the ways in which trails have been conceptualized inside the park, it's very visible that the park keeps this goal of preserving the biome that is present in fiction, while at the same time it narrates the very process of displacement of local populations who had been living in the area of the park for centuries, right? And that had to leave, usually with an indemnification that was quite small, and that had to leave. So, how do you try to keep this biome intact, quote unquote, right? Thinking about the ways through which it has been imagined in fiction, while at the same time kind of disentangling a crucial component for the novel itself, who are the veredeiros, or the people who lived in the park's area. And the second one is Carpentier, Los Pasos Perdidos, The Lost Steps, another very popular novel from the 1950s by the Cuban Alejo Carpentier, that is set in Venezuela in the Gran Sabana. So in the more the Amazonian biome. You can see here Angel Falls, which is one of the tallest falls in the world, waterfalls, and very popular. You may recognize it from other films like Up from Pixar and etc. And so what I propose here, you don't have there is the Canaima National Park, right, which also refers to another novel by Rómulo Gallegos, but La Gran Sabana has been this kind of object of imagination, right, that has a longer tradition to which Carpentier himself refers in chronicles and essays and other interventions. But what Carpentier does in this novel is to propose a kind of a spatialization of time, in which the forest itself is thought as being kind of immobilized and isolated, which of course comes with a whole set of problems and challenges, which I discuss in the chapter. But what I want to bring to us is the ways through which we have this convergence between the environmental imagination of the Gran Sabana as a place that is isolated, that is a self-sufficient microcosms, and that goes hand in hand with the conceptual tool provided by the national park. Okay, I feel like I have talked for more than 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop here, but I very much look forward to the next interventions and to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. So it's time now for José Carlos, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I first want to begin thanking Azucena, Gianfranco, and Ken for this invitation. I didn't prepare anything formal. I'm just gonna probably say something about my own history with this chapter. I recall the first time I say something about this. This was a conference in the pandemics. I recall, and I was in Lima when I read this, and I was just rereading the chapter. It's a good way to read yourself and how you used to think about some complex questions that you have. And I was struck by the fact that I titled this with a question, as if I were to answer the question, and as if it is even possible to answer this question. And the question is actually what is the conflict about, and what I actually probably want to answer is what is at stake when conflicts happen, when environmental conflicts happen in indigenous lands. And to do a little bit of archaeology of this chapter, probably the first time that I made myself this question was in 2013. Before I jumped into the dark pool of academia, I was swimming in a probably darker pool, which was journalism. I was a journalist in Peru. And so I was a parliament reporter going to the Congress building every day. I hated that much. And always forced my editors to send me to the Andes and the Amazon to write chronicles about conflicts and local communities. And I was in this town called Nuevo Andoas. If you Google where it is, it's in the middle of the Amazonian rainforest, writing a story about like oil spilling made by Plus Petrol, which is an Argentinian oil company. And I was interviewing Aurelio Chino Dawa, who's the Awahun leader of that community, and he asked me to sense the disaster because there was someone else who was an American friend, environmentalist working for Rainforest Foundation, which is a STEAM's NGO, who was filing documents to make a trial, a case to find a monetary compensation for the community. And he was dubious. Aurelio Chino Dawa, the indigenous leader, like he was hesitant about whether money was going to be able to compensate the disaster. So he dragged me out of the community. We were working in the forest, and he asked me to be in silence so I was able to sense the disaster. And I was totally zoned out for a few minutes, acknowledging my own probably philosophical incapability to read what he was asking me to read or sense or hear. There was silence, and maybe the silence was something. The silence was probably very telling of that sort of death of the ontological connection that the community had with the forest. And it's been probably 13 years now, and I still think, and of course I fell with the chronicle that I wrote about. I wrote about that, right? And probably that was fair in that moment. I still believe that ontology is kind of the inner side, the unseen layer of what we are treating as ontological conflicts. And when I wrote this chapter, I was trying to expose that. And when I say that, when I state a question of what is the conflict about, the ultimate answer that I want to provide without the expectation of it to be a concrete and absolute answer is that it is ontology, is the ontological commitment that indigenous people has with nature. So basically, my argument in the chapter is that we cannot understand the clashes between indigenous communities and extractive industries, which is the most common type of conflict that you're going to find in the Andean Amazonian corridor, if we only look at them, at the problems, at the conflicts through the lens of economics and, of course, culture. And instead, I propose to view these problems as ontological conflicts. And the conversation was begun probably 15 years now by cultural anthropologists and what is being called the ontological turn, which is probably something that we all somehow discuss in the wide conversation of the environmental humanities. And it is interesting because they describe ontology as a relational practice, which is something good. Like it is pretty accurate. And this work that I study, Wars of Interior, Guerras del Interior, written by Peruvian journalist Joseph Zarate, does that. He is describing indigenous environmental activists struggling against mining companies in the Andes or logging in the Amazon. Specifically the case of Máxima Acuña, who's an icon of indigenous environmentalism in Peru, and Edwin Chota, who was a land defender who was murdered actually by mafias in Peruvian Amazon, in the Ashaninka nation. I was trying to study at some point what are the ontological implications of their activism, and that is what I try to illuminate in this chapter. And it's curious because I don't believe that this anthropologically driven ontological turn is fully leaving behind what we all have studied as ontology, which is Heidegger and his like ultimate the metaphysics of being, right? Like for Heidegger, the here and now, the metaphysics is the Dasein, right? It's condensed in the idea of the Dasein. What I believe is that actually what cultural anthropologists do is to pluralize the who of the Dasein, right? For the La Cadena, these plural who's are sentient entities, right? The tinacunas that we can see in earth beings. And for Edwin Chota, as he's written in this chronicle by Zarate, is the Kamari, right? The evil, this unseen, invisible entity that is here to disappear and eradicate Ashanikas. I don't want to go beyond the 5 minutes that you asked me, so I'm gonna try to keep myself on track of what I probably want to say. But it's that at the end of the day, in my view, through these cases, ecological conflicts expose, of course, the failure of modern rationality, which is something that we already were warned about in cultural anthropology. But at the end is that the fact that when Peruvian state or mining corporations enter territory and they operate under what anthropologists call relational politics, to them nature is a collection of resources, right? Gold, wood, oil, and that is separating nature from humanity, which is basically stating an implicit externalization of nature, which entails a constitutional and philosophical split. For Blasser, the split summoned the question of what exists and what does not exist. But to me, conflicts force us to try to answer what is the conflict about, what is at stake. And productivist, capitalist, neocolonial answers will talk about like gross domestic product, probably, which is the answer that was provided back then by neoliberal president Alan Garcia in Peru, which is the temporal frame that we are discussing. But for someone like Edwin Chota or Máxima Acuña, this is an actual existential question. This is basically forcing them to renegotiate their ontological commitment with the plurality of beings, the plurality of whom's that integrates the here, the Dasanian Heideggerian. I don't bring Heidegger in this chapter. I don't think it's useful in this particular text, but definitely one of the lessons from Guerras del Interior is to illustrate through these chronicles the lives of activists as specific enactments of indigenous ecologies as the containers of indigenous philosophy. And that is what that is why I believe this chapter that I wrote in 2021, it is quite useful for what I'm writing in this moment about indigenous ecologies. When someone like Eduardo Kohn asks us to do an anthropology of ontologies, he's actually asking us to pay attention to the actionality of living in the world, of the here and now. And yes, I believe that's probably one of the topics that I think is brought by this chapter in particular. And I wanted to say that. I don't know, I hit the 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jose Carlos. Yeah, you did it, definitely. Trust me. Anyway, thank you for that. And well, finally, Roberto, please.
Hi. Well, first I'd like to, can you hear me? Okay. All right. So I'd like to say special thanks to Azucena, Ken, and Gianfranco for being able to be part of the book and also to be here with you today in this debate. And obviously, thank you also for the team in Stockholm University. I'll share a slide with some images so we can visualize what chapter talks about. Just a minute. I think we can see this. Okay. So my chapter examines images from the aftermath of two ecological disasters. The first one, which is this picture that you're seeing here now, is the rupture of a mining dam in Mariana in Brazil. It's also in Minas Gerais, the same state that it's present in Victoria Saramago's chapter. And this is a disaster that occurred in 2015, and the photographer went to the area kind of like 5 months after the disaster. The second one is the aftermath of the fires, the forest fires, the bushfires in New South Wales in Australia during the summer of 2019 and 2020. And I'll show you the pictures in a minute of this other catastrophe. So when we think of the colonial modern machine and the socio-economic extractive model that it constructs and that is responsible for the climate urgency that we live now, it's based on this epistemology of separations that, I mean, we have already mentioned here a little bit. This idea that we create this idea of a transcendental nature that is separated from humankind. We also create these binaries, yeah, like man, woman, white, black, racial divisions, gender divisions. And these are also connected to how this economy will make these territories extractable and these bodies, subaltern bodies, extractable as well. All of this is anchored also in a visuality that will sustain these divisions, that are physical divisions, but are also sensible divisions. So when I look at these images, I'm looking at how they will contest this sensible division and this sensible regime that is connected to modernity, and how they will claim, for example, like how they will contest these divisions, these political divisions, claim a certain agency to nature, and maybe also a certain subjectivity, especially in the photographs that come from Australia. In these catastrophes, and in the photographs of these catastrophes, a series of trees acquire a certain agency and subjectivity. The image itself displaces the photographic decisive moment to a time before the arrival of the photographer, so that the photographs become a negotiation between an image made by nature and one that's made by photographer. So these are some of the other pictures from the Brazilian setting. And here's the pictures from the Australian setting. So the image exists before the photograph's taken, right? And the whole of modern photography is based on this idea of the photographer, that's someone that has a trained eye that's capable of capturing a moment, like a space-time moment in life, and creating a photograph. But in these cases, the pictures are the photograph. This moment is already present in nature before. It's nature that produces the decisive moment with these images. They also condense the complex temporalities of climate change. A phantasmatic stillness of a lifeless present, and the acceleration of a past destructive projected into a near future. In the Mariana, the trees held back the toxic mud and inscribed this action on their bark with a red line that cuts across the entire landscape. In New South Wales, the burnt trees left an X-ray of their bodies imprinted on the ground in such an eerie way that white settlers called these marks tree ghosts. So basically what I do is I look at these images and see how it disarranges modern sensibility and how it reveals that which is unthinkable for modernity. And this is looking at these global South territories that are very distinct in some ways. Australia and Brazil are very singular, but they are connected through this extractive, obviously, this extractive economy, the colonial past, and also by the indigenous populations and indigenous thinking that are present in both territories. That's it. This short introduction.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Well, thank you, all of you. So I think now it's time for questions. So all the people who is attending the seminar, this is the moment that you can just get into a question to the authors, to the editors, and to open discussion as well. You can formulate your questions in Spanish or English or Portuguese, but we will answer anyway, or the authors will answer in English. Okay, so please go ahead, raise your hands if you are, if you want to make questions, okay, or comments, whatever. This is the time. Do we have questions? No, not for the moment. So, in that case, I will take the opportunity to question a few things that I got in mind about the book. I have divided some specific aspects, of the book, like coloniality and extractivism, epistemological diversity, political ecology and sovereignty, and speculative future. So about the first one, aesthetics of resistance. I'm going to formulate the question for all of you. You just can answer whatever you please to answer, and or even discuss about possible answers to that. So this is the thing, how I at least how I have planned it. In what ways do in what ways do the various cultural mediums analyzed, such as films, literature, and visual arts, provide a unique visual or narrative language that traditional climate science often lacks? This could be the first one. So go ahead. You are the authors. José Carlos, please.
Well, I guess that everyone has a different answer for it. It all
Yeah.
depends on the materials. I believe that chronicles and nonfiction texts, they are definitely helping us to kind of periodize how the changes are happening in this specific context. But I definitely believe in that, for instance, materials like the one that Roberto just presented, they have a very potent idea for us, and maybe I am answering this and kind of sliding a subtle question to Roberto at some point, but because I read your chapter and didn't see the pictures. I don't think we have the pictures in the book, right? Or maybe there are in a different, not in the next. Okay, so with the pictures, I have a different idea of the chapter, and I was wondering if those photos are granting us, and this is also like kind of answering, trying to look for an answer of what Juan Carlos is saying, like a phenomenological access to the disaster. Like the disaster is something that we visually experience, and that it unavoidably, and this is something that maybe you say in the chapter, like it has like consequences in our consciousness on how we are consciously framing what the unthinkable looks like through these pictures. I don't know if I'm overreading your chapter and your photos, Roberto, but maybe we can start dialoguing in this way.
Yeah,
I might be wrong. I might be wrong.
No, I think there is an immanent quality to the photos, that they create this corporality of the disaster that is embodied in the trees. Either the kind of dead trees with the red mud, or what remains of the trees, which is this mark that kind of like denounces that there was a certain spirit in there, even though, I mean, I'm not saying that the white settlers believe that there are spirits, but it's just the way that the idea of a ghost comes up, right? So I think that's an effect. I think there's an effective quality to this other language, but I think there's also an immanence to the language, to the pictures. And I've been working recently with Guimarães Rosa, with one of his short stories called, in Portuguese, it's called Recado do Morro, which means message from the mountain. And Rosa is as if he's like going pre-modern, like the idea of the word evokes a body. There's like no separation between, and that's one of the messages of the mountains, like how do you understand what the mountain is saying has to do with the idea that language produces a world, like there's a world making in the way that it narrates, right? So I don't know, I throw this to the other panelists to discuss.
Victoria, yeah, please.
Yeah, just in relation to what José Carlos was saying, which I think is just so important. I feel like in agreeing with you and what you're saying about the ontological turn, and I would add that the ontological turn tends to keep us in an ontological realm, right? But I think we need a lot more attention to the phenomenological, right? To the senses in which the ways through which we experience disasters are pretty crucial in the ways through which we can even understand what a disaster is and how we want to define a disaster, right? And in the sense, I think that images as the ones Roberto was showing us, are like they have a specific way of engaging with collective imagination that the mainstream media or like technical reports and all the other ways in which we have available to narrate disaster cannot, right? And via this phenomenological path, right? This kind of experiential engagement with what happened there.
Very well. Someone else?
Maybe I can.
Azucena, please. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I want to comment a little bit on my chapter that I work with two films that engage with global waste that is taken from the global north to the global south. And first I was interested in the way that was represented, but then I realized that what was interesting about these two films is the way that they in which they canalize a kind of a collective experience of the communities that sense this kind of toxicity in their bodies and were not listened to by institutions or by the scientific community or national health centers, and how the films could canalize that through the rumors that were passed on by the different communities, or a visitor that came there and wanted to make this a film that was later used in a legal case against a Swedish corporation that sent the toxic material to Chile. So in that sense, I agree with Victoria's idea that there's a sense of community that is captured in these materials that it might not be captured in more, you said about climate science approaches or frames, that I think that this material brings to the discussion of how we experience or how this climate change and this climate phenomenon is experienced in these regions. And at the same time, I also would like to turn a little bit the question, instead of making what climate science lacks, and what the humanities or cultural products can bring, because I think there is also a much richer dialogue of these many of these cultural products with scientific frames or ways in which science has also measured toxicity, and environmental conservation is also parts of the natural science. So I think that there's a much more dynamic richer dialogue and exchanges between the sciences and the cultural products. than we usually think of.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
was going to say, if I
Franco.
have Juan Carlos, sorry. No, I think another aspect that maybe I can draw from my own chapter is also the need to think about the material dimension of the discussion we have, that not only goes to the say, phenomenological or ontological discussion, but also is the relevance of at least in the case of the kind of cultural product I was dealing with, which is its feature in the cover art of the book, which is Ana Lenzo's installations. And the work that Ana Lenzo does, at least in that specific installation, which is what the mind gives, the mind takes, which is Alenzo going to the Venezuelan Amazon, specific areas where you extract gold, and dealing and bringing those materials right to the fore, right, and showing how these specific technologies of extraction are shaping right the forms of extraction in specific areas of Venezuela. In that specific case, are relevant to understand as well the different politics of labor, of extraction, of material production and value that are taking place in these specific areas. Which, to me at least, and that's what I was trying to say in that chapter, put culture in the same sort of spectrum of the material discussions. It's not something that is completely, in their own sphere, but in a way it dialogues constantly with that other reality. So in that sense, it adds up to the whole discussion. So just, kind of following your question of what it gives, and I agree with Azucena, which is telling, this richer dialogue that we can have when we think about these two kind of separated dimensions. They're not exactly separated, but in a way, as these specific works show us, they are more entangled than we think, right? So this is the relevance of going back to these type of works and analyzing these and bringing these to the fore in terms of what they tell us about climate change or the warming condition, is that they are not separated from those realities, but they're very much entangled with them. So to me, at least, that material dimension is also very important to understand.
Absolutely, and it gives and provides that interdisciplinary framework, which is also very important in projects such like this. Well, in this case, just the book. Okay, just to continue, second level that is this about coloniality and extractivism. Probably, Gianfranco, you probably will start with that. The question will be,
Carlos,
see?
there's a question in the Q&A.
Okay, sorry,
I don't know
haven't
why
seen
it
it.
appeared to me.
Yeah. So,
Do you see it?
no, definitely not. Sorry.
The
Here.
question says,
Yeah,
aren't
yeah,
power relations
yeah. Now. Okay. Aren't power relations on the background of our discussion at the local and the global levels? So it's a question by Christine. So that's the question. Do you hear? Yeah. Okay, now I can see why I didn't read it so properly. I have my glasses. And power relations on the background of our discussions at the local and the global levels. Thank you, Christine. So, who wants to answer?
I would say yes, not just in the background, probably also in the foreground.
José Carlos, please.
Sorry, I just jumped. My apologies. But I would say yes. No, the short answer is yes, and I would think their power relationships are kind of all over the stories that we tell in the book. And so, speaking just for my chapter, I would say yes, it is there. It is in how the modern nation is instituted. And even when power relations are trying to be reset through a more, like, let's say, eco-friendly approach, they led us to the failure. To me, the big lesson of this and speaking also of national parks, is what Rafael Correa did with the Yasuni Park in Ecuador. Like, he was trying to reset the Ecuadorian constitution, bringing some indigenous insights into the writing, and in parallel, he was also submitting this national park to the profoundly uneven power relations of eco-capitalism, right? By selling like bonos de carbonos. I don't even know how to say that in English, but bonos de carbono, carbon stocks. So he was basically just opening a new capitalist market, and where indigenous people of the Yasuni part were always going to be on the underside of these relations. I'll pass the floor to my colleagues.
Roberto
Okay,
and
yeah.
Victoria. Yeah.
I think, yeah, I mean, maybe you have to also think of the question differently, like how can we think power relations from our own perspective, you know, not just from the Foucault tradition, you know, thinking like Mbembe that would redress the question of power and of biopolitics. And also we have to think, and then thinking with Marisol de la Cadena that when she analyzes the conflicts and struggles in Andean territory, the power relations also involve the other beings, you know, like the Kiaracuna and the mountains, and they are also are called to come to the negotiations and to take part in the asymmetries that are established in the conflicts. So this is so not just to say, yeah, there are power relations, but how are these power relations here lived, especially in these South American post-colonial or neo-colonial or extractivist economy realities with all of these different ontological perspectives at play.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would add to that. I think that's a crucial question. Thank you, Christine, for asking it. Power relations are everywhere. Yeah, I agree that they are in the background, in the foreground. They are just everywhere. And in this sense, I think, you know, we have usually a tendency to see, like, to read for cultural objects as kind of resisting or contesting hegemonic discourses, dominant narratives, which they do. I mean, that's definitely like a very crucial way through which we can make sense of this cultural production. But I think that's not the whole story. And I think that as, you know, scholars trying to understand what is going on, we also have to understand the ways through which cultural objects can enable or can power relations or can just enter the interstices of power relations in ways that go beyond contestation and resistance, right? And that's, I mean, my chapter goes in this direction when I work with very canonical works, right? That on the one hand are like enabling conservationist initiatives, which is great, but in a way that also opens a lot of room for like more problematic approaches, such as the displacement of local populations, right? So yeah, I think we have to be very mindful of what those cultural objects are actually doing and the ways through which their impact is not unidimensional, right? It is not purely on the resistance side, or not necessarily, right? So I think it's something we as cultural scholars need to be very attuned to.
Mhm. Thank you, Victoria. So I think we are a bit running out of time, but anyway, since I think, I mean, there are many questions that we can, you know, add to this webinar, and I would really would like to continue with just asking a couple of things more, if you allow me. I think this is a good opportunity to, you know, exchange thoughts and ideas about all these topics. So that second question, it was how do the contributors link the current climate emergency to historical patterns of colonial extractivism, and why is this historical perspective essential for understanding the region's vulnerability? So,
I could jump in and talk a little bit about, so moving a bit away from my chapter for this book and thinking more about my current research. I'm working more on energy and more specifically electricity, and thinking about electricity stemming from renewable sources, right? And one of the things that I have not written about, but I have been thinking about is like the fact that renewable sources, contrary to fossil fuels, they can have a much longer imaginative genealogy, right? In the sense that if you think about oil, you end up like stuck in some point of origin in the 19th century, etc., right? I mean, you can think about oil in a broader temporality, but usually you will have like this kind of emergence of oil in collective imagination in the 19th century. But if you think about like hydropower, if you think about solar power, if you think about wind power, water, sun, wind, they have just been so predominant in Latin American cultural production, right? So how can we think about like those sources of energy before those forms of renewable energy emerged like and became and came to have the role that they have today? That's something I have been thinking about.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you,
Which
Victoria.
will allow
Thank
us to
you.
reread for
Mhm.
this like in the more longer durée, right?
Mhm.
Like for renewable energy.
Mhm. Thank you. Someone else? Anyone?
You can just add something to your question, and thank you for the question. I think it's a very important one. Well, there's a pattern of climate change events hitting harder in different parts of the planet, which usually they happen to be also the colonial parts, or that are now, maybe we call them post-colonial, but that coincide with the regions colonized by Europeans in the 16th century. So that is why the historical approach to colonialism and extractivism is important to consider. At the same time, I think that it's also necessary to not to overlook that view, but also think where the cultural products are placed in that long durée history of power of the global north and the global south. What stories they emphasize and which stories they happen to reinforce in particular moments and situations. With that story in mind, behind, back, and also beyond that story in particular situations, because otherwise we tend to be tied to a history that is that times have also changed, and there are also there are colonization patterns, new colonization patterns within the so-called colonized or global south regions as well. So that I would say about the importance of that perspective. And José Carlos.
Yeah, I'll just probably very shortly answer that from an indigenous studies perspective. I believe that land dispossession, the historicity of land dispossession, is a good way to periodize. It's a good periodization for what it's being framed as coloniality or the fundamental arrival of capitalism. If you believe that the parcelization of land and the slaves in the Andes, in the Americas in general, it is a seminal moment for capitalism. And we can take that as a starting point to what today people call that the coloniality of nature. If you follow the ideas of Hector Alimonda or green capitalism, if you read it through, like as Bellamy Foster would say, for instance. At the end of the day, this is also entangling itself with the question of power relations, and yeah, I believe that we will end up getting stuck into the history of land dispossession, which has a large scholarship that we can all consult for sure.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you, José Carlos. Probably you can continue with answering the next question, since we are going to be hitting that way probably just a bit. That this level have named epistemological diversity, and the question is, to what extent do the chapters of the book, of course, foreground indigenous and marginalized epistemologies as necessary tools to dismantle the cognitive impasses of the Western-centric climate discourses. So, maybe José Carlos. Okay, José Carlos,
Yeah,
yes.
I was assuming that question is kind
Because
of maybe not as much. Sorry, there's a pop-up. Am I here? Something pop. Oh, okay, yes. I thought I was gone for a few seconds. In this chapter, not as much as I should. If I had a chance to rewrite this chapter, probably we will have more of the voices of what things that has been said in the past 4 or 5 years by Nemonte Nkimo, by Moira Millán,
Mhm.
whose intervention, that when Monte Nkimo was writing this article that was actually published in The Guardian, which was a British newspaper, right? About when the Amazon was on fire in this huge wildfire in 2021, like your helicopters and planes are too late. We sense this before. I believe she's making an ontological statement. And when Moira Millán theorizes with a pugilistic writing about terricide, she's making an ontological statement. Probably something that we all have to learn, non-indigenous mestizo scholars like me working on indigenous studies, is learning to frame that as a theoretical settlement. And yeah, that's something that is been done in other parts. Like black existentialists are writing with Fanon, and Fanon writes also like British pugilistic style. So yeah, that would be my answer to it. Juan Carlos, I'll pass the floor to Roberto.
Okay, Roberto and Azucena after you.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking now about extractivism. Can we untangle extractivism from modernity, from capitalism, from modern epistemology? I don't think it's possible. I think from a Marxist perspective, this is all connected. The idea of primitive accumulation or surplus or whatever. And obviously, and can think of indigenous thinking from the Pierre class perspective of societies against the state, which also we could say a society against modernity, in the sense that they are producing not an alternative thinking. They are producing a thinking that is in opposition to our capitalist economic model. Like if you talk to some indigenous communities in the Amazon, the idea of green bonds, to use the term of the book, is unthinkable. Yeah. It makes no sense. And again, so we're thinking of solutions that are within our model of capitalist extractivism. So now we're going to think of forests as something that you can extract. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from how the way they think, and especially the relational ontologies that they come from.
Definitely, 100% agree. Azucena.
Maybe I don't know if exactly I can talk about from indigenous communities or perspectives, but I think that I have like kind of 3 examples to show like how these approaches can, I don't know if dismantle, but at least challenge the conceptions of Western modernity or hegemonic conceptions of Western culture about environmental questions. One is the idea, like in the Western world and in Europe mostly, we have this idea of sustainability and turning to electricity and to the green products. But if you compare that discourse with what is happening in many Latin American places where the people are showing that that discourse is sustained by the batteries composed of lithium taken from either the lithium triangle or some other places where lithium is being searched for. So there's those cultural products that engage with like the ones Gianfranco is also like working with, and Victoria are showing that it's not the dismantling of that that discourse of green sustainability, but it's also showing that there is materially and community sustained by particular territories that are suffering the consequences of the upheaval of that discourse in many Western countries and economies. And in the case of my one of the films that I study in my book, while in Europe, especially in Sweden, in the 1980s, the environmental law protections were emerging to protect the national territories. They were shipping toxicity to Chile, especially to this place in Arica in the Atacama Desert. So what this film can do is maybe not dismantle, but expose in the eyes of the Western world the backyard or the material and the community cost of that shipment while they were protecting their own territories. So I think that there's a relationship of exposition and also claiming. You can take it also to claims for reparations that are often silenced in global discourses of how do we solve this impasse or this conflict. But I think that they can do a work of exposing the holes in the Western narrative of electricity and modernity.
If I
Thank
may
you.
say something, I'm sorry, I just lost
Yeah.
my connection because I was on my phone. No, but I think I'm just listening to what Azucena was saying. I think I missed, I don't know if this is part of another question, but I just want to say that something that, again, just drawing from my chapter, that is at least really interesting to me in trying to expose or document or register these dynamics. That in the case of what Ana Lenzo does with that specific installation is also tracing, as I said at the very beginning, the materiality of this extraction, but it's also the intersection of two specific discourses that in a way are completely related. That is, I mean, green statecraft, right? The idea of the state as investing and supporting renewable energies and let's say, the transition or so-called transition, right, to renewables. And then the other side, which is green capitalism, right, which is the firms and the investors that in a way contribute to that. They come together in some way, very, kind of a Marxist approach in contradictory ways, right? They're this dialectics and the way they work together to shape a specific environment and to change the conditions of living in that specific place. So I think that by looking at these specific, again, cultural products or artistic expressions, we have at least the possibility to see to some degree how these two big discourses in a way are connected or are in a way reproduced or materialized in specific places. And I mean, there's different things in that specific art installation that speak to that, right? From the cabin, the extractive companies use to extract specific minerals, and that Alenzo recovers and brings to the exhibition gallery and exposes it to the open rank and gives us an entry point to the technology of extraction, to the way the state is saying from one side that they support eco development, and on the other hand are doing completely the opposite, right? So I think again, I don't know if I'm out of the question, but I think it definitely was related to what Azucena was saying. I think it adds up to that big discussion we're trying to bring to the fore in the book, right? With the chapters of Roberto, Victoria, Jose that are part of the book too.
Thank you, Gianfranco. So we truly are running out of time, but I don't want to leave these two last questions behind, right? So what I'm gonna do is just to formulate both of them, and you just feel free, please, so whatever of you prefer to answer. If it's one of the other one, doesn't matter the question. But those are the questions. The first of them respond to the level political, ecological, and sovereignty. And it says, how does the book argue that the climate crisis in Latin America is fundamentally inseparable from ongoing struggles for such as land rights, resources, sovereignty, and social justice. And the second question, respond to the level speculative futures. What specific radical futures? And I clearly mentioned that notion, radical futures, or alternative modes of coexistence are proposed throughout the book as viable forms of resistance against the inevitability of ecological collapse. Those are the two questions. I don't know if it's a clear proposal in that sense. Maybe it sounds a bit speculative, but since you are been working on that, maybe you can provide a certain answer to that. So please, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, I mean, I can say something very quick. I don't,
Yeah.
I don't exactly. I think I cannot answer the second question in terms of speculative futures or something of the like. But I think that in terms of the first question, which is how the political ecology of, I mean, the whole historical, right, density of Latin America being affected by extractivism and then the economy of extraction. Yeah, I mean, it's a structural issue, right, that is very much connected to the way Latin America has been in other regions, of course, of the global South. But then you have in other places that, to some degree, they have the same experience. But, how these places have been portrayed as providers of raw materials, right, and how the place they've occupied in the economy is a place of providers, suppliers of raw materials that then are manufactured and then are resold and we consume, right? So I think that kind of uneven relation that takes us back to the 60s and 70s, right, with the discourse of dependency theory and an economy, that is constantly dependent on, say, the center, right? It's in a way outdated, but I think it still explains a lot of the historical layers that can explain at some degree why Latin America as a region, at least economically speaking, is subjugated to these forms of uneven relations, right, with other, let's say, hegemonic powers. And you take, current situations with not only what we had in colonial times in terms of the Hispanic America connected to Spain and other parts of the world, and the same with Brazil and Portugal, but what you have later on with the UK and the US, and today with China, right? So these kind of relations are still there, and I think they're very much part of the structure of economic dependency and relations that definitely trickle down to other social issues and forms of inequality, social, environmental, and you name it.
Thank you, Gianfranco. Victoria.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of things in relation to the first question. I think we are in a crossroad moment because we are like this post-pink tide in Latin America, right? And living the effects of this kind of very strange combination of leftist governments, and I think perhaps mostly of Evo Morales in Bolivia and Labor Party governments in Brazil, in which you have on the one hand a push for a much stronger presence of alternative epistemologies, environmental legislation, right, the rights of the Madre Naturaleza, I know that. And on the other hand, a big expansion of extractivistic, of extractivist activities, of mining, of fossil fuel extraction. So it's like this kind of very strange combination, right, that has also provided the material basis for the explosion in consumption in some of those countries. So like this kind of very muddy waters in what concerns the political ecology in those regions. And to answer to your last question, yeah, when I think about the future, I cannot help thinking about Ailton Krenak talking about, a super important thinker from the Krenak people who also were greatly affected by the disasters in Minas Gerais, the rupture of the dams in Mariana, then Brumadinho. And Ailton Krenak talks about ideas to postpone the end of the world, right? Which are basically like a storytelling based ideas. And bringing also to our attention something that Kyle White also says, that for Indigenous peoples, this collapse has been lived for centuries, right? So what can we learn from this experience? And I think that from there, we can perhaps find a way of thinking or speculating about a future.
Definitely. So, anyone else want to add something?
Just so in relation
Final
to
remarks or
the final
something.
remarks relation to the future, and
Yeah.
agreeing with Victoria, the indigenous eschatology, there's a lot about avoiding the catastrophe.
Mhm.
So when we question this, how can we create radical futures or speculative futures? What the indigenous eschatology tells us is it's not just like creating futures, it's actually avoiding the only future that seems possible to us now. And Vivero de Castro wrote this paper like 3 years ago where he proposes this provocation that we need to unpredict the future.
Yeah.
And unpredicting means also like moving from this idea of engineering, modeling, calculations that only presents one future. So there's another way of rewiring the way we think. Has to do with like a more like a bricklayer thinking or indigenous thinking of unpredicting and opening up certain singularities that can appear as escape routes, as like Pernac does through storytelling. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. José Carlos.
Yeah, and to add just very shortly, the only space where I find some hope, because when I think of this question about the future, I always drown myself in pessimism, is like indigenous governance of land, territorial governance for indigenous people. And yes, we are facing these dramatic years of post-Pink Tie like administrations with their failures, right? The constitutionalization of Buen Vivir into constitutions and the oxymoronic politics of Morales and Correa themselves. But yet we still have some instances, like I'm thinking in the Amazon, the case of the One Piece people working in Loreto near the border with Brazil. We have some few yet problematic cases in Cauca in Colombia, and the same terms apply to Mapuche people in Chile, and of course Zapatistas, right, who became like the lead of what is autonomy and territorial governance. So yeah, maybe we have this constellation of cases, communities, collectives that will give us a lesson once we turn the page of this new far right wing moment that we all will have to survive. That would be my addendum. And thank you, Juan.
Thank you, José Carlos. So I think this is it. Well, the book definitely is going to help scholars and readers in general to rethink. There is okay, to rethink all these matters that are really important in nowadays, to especially rethink that possible futures, and also to attend the particularities of the crisis that the eco crisis, eco social, and everything related to that you discussing in the book is how affects population and environments and in general. So thank you for that. I think it's a quite valuable book, and I just really would like to thank all of you, the editors, of course, also authors of different chapters: Ken Benson, Gianfranco Selgas, Azucena Castro, Victoria Saramago, José Carlos, were you surnames? Diaz, José Carlos, and Roberto as well. Thank you for also for your answers and for your presentation. And once again, I really would like to apologize for the previous, technical problems that we experienced by the end of the beginning of the seminar. And well, that's it. Thank you so much to all of you.